Do we get trolls on YouTube links?
No, but it's never too late.
It's like, come on, trolls, bring it on.
This is a pretty easy target. I mean, all right. So everybody, welcome to the Architecture Special Interest Group for Kubernetes. It is Thursday, October 26th, 2017. I am your host, Jay Singer-Dumars. I work for Microsoft. They pay my paycheck, but honestly, I work for Kubernetes, as we all do. So we're going to run through the backlog and some other things in the agenda. The agenda is available via short URL at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And you can follow along after the fact there and see who is in attendance. So we're going to start with just a quick look at the backlog. Let me share my screen here real quick, so we can look at this. Share screen. Oh boy, too many windows. Can you see that? Okay, good. All right, so I don't want to actually go through this line by line more. I just want to make everybody aware that we have this backlog and that these are things that we need to do, I would say, hopefully sooner than later for 1.9. There's some things that we should look at asynchronously. I know that we're all pretty busy with reviews and whatnot of other things, but specifically this architecture diagram and the cleanup the proposals directory is really critical work. The reason why, partially, is at least for the design proposals, we want to get everything ready to move to the KEP process, the Kubernetes enhancement process, proposal process, so that we can start reformulating the way we manage features, quote unquote, and all that good stuff. So there's a lot of predicates here to the work that we want to do in other parts of the project that we need to finish. So.
Offer 2 cents there real quick.
Please, Tim.
I wrote a KEP proposal
for
SIG cluster lifecycle.
Mm-hmm.
I found the format for the fields is a little bit prescriptive, and in fact the nomenclature is a little bit different than what you might expect when you're designing it. So we might want to do a pilot type of rollout where we refine the fields that we want to do, because in that way we get quick churn and we don't force everybody into a process before we've actually vetted it ourselves. Right?
Yes.
I would view the KEP process as it is as kind of at alpha stage, to be honest. I think, it's still marked as draft there. So I think I'm happy to get together with you, Tim, and take some notes and do sometime in the next week, do a turn on that other folks can look at, because it's been on my list to actually do another edit of that process.
And we had talked about sort of retrofitting an existing, something that is like daemon sets or something that's like super solid and has gone through the various stages through the KEP process, just as a mental exercise. I would love to still do that whiteboarding exercise to see if that meets all the requirements, because that would be a great way to see if this matches. And I definitely want to know, Tim, like what are the parts of the nomenclature that seem really vague or not specific to the process that we're trying to align and whatnot. So that would be great to document that.
I wouldn't use the word vague. I'd use the word Byzantine, because the nomenclature is different than every other document I've ever seen before in design specs and stuff. So.
All right. Okay. Well, I mean, we can go through that now and start taking notes. I think that's useful, important stuff, or we can take it offline. Whatever folks think.
I'd be happy to take it offline because it seems like we have a full agenda. I just wanted to put that 2 cents in there.
I do think that this is a critical sort of like, this is going to be sort of the way that we do business in this group moving forward, most probably, is that like, I think we want to get to the point where it's like every meeting, we have like 2 KEPs on the agenda that we're going to actually go ahead and review and discuss. And so I think getting to the point where that's useful for everybody, both the producers and the consumers of the KEPs, I think is critical. So.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that we be very careful about piloting it with anything other than a very willing SIG and a very willing enhancement proposer, because otherwise we risk, kind of irritating people with a very alpha process, which is going to require quite a bit of massaging, I think, to make it useful. So Tim's proposal seems like a great one if he's is the said willing proposer and willing SIG.
Cool.
I kvetched about it. Willing is debatable, but I'll act as tribute for that one, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I don't want to pour salt on people's wounds too soon. So great. And I think that's something we should absolutely do is have, a lot of SIGs have a 10-minute demo slot. Maybe we have a 10 or 15-minute KEP slot, just as a running thing. So, so there's a lot of other things in this backlog. Honestly, it's starting to feel a little bit like we're never ever going to reach some of these things because everything we do takes so long to discuss. So we do need to figure out a way to time box discussions and come up with some sort of way of agreeing or disagreeing on things. I mean, we have the lazy consensus model and whatnot, but I don't feel necessarily that that's a great mechanism for in-flight discussions. So maybe if anybody's feeling excited about proposing that, I would nominate Caleb because he's got a really deep understanding of different consensus models, or anybody else who has a passion for that to maybe talk about how we do that. That is a direct relevance on the second bullet point in the agenda, and actually a third as well. So somebody put this in here. I'm not sure who did, but if that person is present, could you bring this up and we can talk about it?
Well, this is Matt Freeman. So just real quick on the architecture layers. I mean, it moved along for a while, and then I put out a couple of things to ask for review, and I haven't gotten any feedback on it, and particularly from Brian, because he had some strong opinions on some of the organizational stuff. And so that's where it's kind of at. There's a whole bunch of diagrams and whatnot, and they need a little bit more feedback before I go make the next iteration on them. And so I can poke him again on it, but that's what's holding that particular one up. Unless other folks want to get in, I'll go ahead and share the link again. But that's where I'm kind of waiting.
Sorry, Matt. I've been sidetracked by several things.
You're here now. No. I understand. You get busy. So I'll send that stuff off again to get some feedback, and then I can go make some more changes.
Cool.
Yeah, I wanted to just bring up something that came up in yesterday's steering committee stuff as well, which is, I mean, I think it's a good idea to have these architectural diagrams, but I think it's also useful to step back and try and clearly enunciate what exactly the problems we're trying to solve by coming up with whatever layers, architectures, definitions we do, because otherwise it becomes very difficult to judge better alternatives from worse alternatives unless you have a specific problem you're trying to solve and you say this thing solves that problem better or worse than the other option. And I haven't, maybe I missed something, but I haven't actually seen a clear statement other than the one Brandon sent out yesterday of exactly what problems we're trying to solve.
Well, I'll tell you the problem that I'm trying to solve. Most folks, especially those outside of, say, this meeting and some of the SIGs, don't understand Kubernetes architecture or layout or how things come together or where the ecosystem fits. They don't have a clear picture. And so, I mean, the reason that I took on taking Brian's stuff and trying to iterate on it was to try to help mere mortals understand what the heck is going on and where the different parts are.
I think one of the things that makes me less than super excited about this stuff is I feel like we're trying to do two things with the same set of diagrams. The one thing being really represent the true architecture of what's going on. And then the other thing is actually break down sort of a lot of complex concepts in a way that users can understand, which, I hesitate to say like it's kind of a little bit on the architecture type of thing, but it actually can be more useful than that. And I feel like a lot of the stuff in the current set of diagrams is creating categorizations that don't have any basis in code. And I think in some ways these are aspirational, and so that's good. And it may be useful for users to understand sort of what are the core concepts of the systems I need to understand first. But I think we don't want to over-represent that as actually representing the true architecture of the system, because it's not how the code is structured right now, at least. And so for me, that those two warring goals make me uncomfortable with some of this stuff, to be honest.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
Go ahead.
Carry on. I was going to say that, and that sort of gets back to, if we don't have a clear statement of what we're trying to achieve with the diagram, then we run into the problem of, not solving the specific thing. So if the specific problem we're trying to solve is a conceptual overview of Kubernetes, then that requires one thing. If it is understanding how all the code fits together, that's a different problem with a different solution.
So I wanted to interject here because Joe's comment echoes previous lives of mine where I had to do what were multiple views or slices of the architecture. And we kind of channeled Carnegie Mellon's software architecture document structure, where you have the different conceptual views based upon who's the actor involved. And if you have a user story for that actor, that makes a lot of sense how you slice the view, but no one view is fully encompassing. It's only an individual actor's perspective. And then as you change actors and user stories, you'll have different slices of views, and then they come together at some point in time later on.
Yeah, my main target audience for my initial diagram is actually the Kubernetes contributors. I want to make it, one big challenge we have is that our code is kind of a hairball, and we are trying to disentangle it. As more and more things get built by more and more people, we need to make sure that the kind of original architectural intent is not compromised and blurred by people making lots of changes that erode the structure of the system over time, right? So in order to accommodate the growth of the project, we actually need to make the code base more modular than it is right now. So there are a bunch of things that we're going to be doing, like breaking out API machinery to make it generally reusable machinery. We need to inform what plugin points we need for out-of-tree and out-of-process plugins. So that was the main initial goal of doing that. It does have some other potential purposes, or could inform other types of diagrams. For sure, one kind of diagram won't fit everybody. Some people need more detail, some people need less detail. But I think it's been helpful already in terms of enabling people to think about what really are the fundamental primitives of a system. Should this part of the system know about that other part of the system, and things like that. So, yeah, I would like to make some headway on that. My main priority right now is modularizing the code base.
Which was actually the topic that I had here to continue on in the second discussion topic bullet point, was how do we get there, right? So we talked a little bit about API machinery and client Go, and some of this in SIG CLI, SIG apps, and SIG API machinery in the last couple of weeks. It keeps coming up. And it becomes, how do we actually get from where we're at to where we're going to go? It seems like in each of these SIGs, it's, yeah, we need this, but it's not a high enough priority for me to go off and tackle.
Yeah,
SIG,
honestly, I think you just hit the nail on the head there, which is, it is a kind of social engineering and prioritization problem right now, much more than a technical one. I mean, for sure there are technical ones, but they are normal kinds of things that engineers know how to deal with in refactoring and such. So, I think we need to get some agreement and draw some lines in the sand that says after X release, no more things of this kind can be added to the main repository, or this thing needs to move out by such and such a date. We need to actually set some project-wide goals and policies around that, and whitelist or grandfather specific activities instead of the other way around, saying that, you know, this thing cannot happen, but by default everything else goes in. We have been pushing on kube control. We're hampered by just the growth of the project is so rapid and so large. It's hard. We're spread super thin. But we are trying to chip away at the kube control dependencies. One thing that we're doing to try to facilitate making progress there is by using Blaze, or Bazel, sorry. So at the same time, we have the Bazel team trying to remove the obstacles that prevent us from more completely adopting Bazel for the project, like multi-architecture support and things like that. So we are getting support from other parts of Google. Since I think Kubernetes is one of the largest Go projects that exist, these other teams have some interest in not letting us flounder with the tools. Yeah, so we are making progress, but it's a big problem. So that would be one thing. Like if you have any influence over engineers' times in your organization, ask them to spend some amount of time working to just, you know, chop wood and carry water, just chip away at dependencies. Like kube control is the most obvious example of something we should be able to move out, right? Like this has been called out in many places, and just in terms of other parts of the project, they will say, well, we don't want to move out because then we'll be perceived as not being part of the main whatever, and so we want some other thing that's obviously critical to move out before we move out, right? Whether it's kubeadm or Federation or whatever it is. I mean, Federation's actually moving, but you know, we need something to move first that people can see, okay, yeah, this is the direction we're really going to go. So we've chosen kube control. I think there are a bunch of other benefits to moving kube control as well. Like we need to make, right now, we don't even reliably make one release of versions queue work. With kube control, you really need to actually run the same release of kube control as the cluster, which is not a good situation to be in. It should work as long as the APIs work according to our API deprecation policy, right? Unless you need a new feature, it should just work. And for all the API resources, it should just pass through all the fields. So we need to not round trip all the objects. So I would say, like, we need to get client Go out of kube control completely, for example.
And that's actually what I was going to say, because when I brought it up in API machinery, that didn't appear to be one of their priorities. In fact, one of the things, because of doing some of this with clients and that, was, you know, I mean, if it's not one of their priorities and they're not putting folks on it, then that now hampers something else. And so how do we say, okay, we need to get it out?
We are spread way too thin, Matt. I mean, we need to get more people. I mean, we're trying to hire, but we can only do that so quickly and ramp up people.
And if somebody were going to come in to try to help this situation along, then how would they even know what to do? Because that's one of the things we have for new folks to come in. Like, this isn't an easy problem. And so even somebody who knows Kubernetes says, now I'm going to step in and start trying to solve this space. Because you break something out, now that repo needs to have people sign up to be owners. You've got to deal with dependency management and how you move. There's a whole bunch of these other things that you're going to have to do each time. And in that first time, it needs to be solved. And now, where's kind of that list? Okay, we're going to go move client Go out. Really, you got to move client Go and API machinery and API out.
No one's going to know the list until they do it. Like, people need to jump in, spend a lot of time on it, ask questions on Slack, and figure it out. Like the work Jeff has done to find all the kube control dependencies. I mean, it's a matter of putting in a lot of build visibility rules, iterating, moving things around, refactoring. Like, it's not rocket science, it's iterative work. And until someone does it once, we're not going to have an example that other people can follow.
Yeah, I think there's another problem, Brian, which is, and I agree with you that there's no substitute for actually doing the stuff. But the other problem people run into is that there isn't actually like a full mandate for some of this stuff. So you try and do this and you have to end up getting, half a dozen SIGs to approve your PR because, that's where the code is. and some of them say, well,
It's just totally not true. If someone wants to sign up to do it, we can totally solve that problem. Like to break all the kubectl dependencies, Jeff Regan has free reign to break whatever dependencies he wants.
Okay, so we're saying that we're
here's one of my problems here is that this stuff isn't written down anywhere. I don't see sort of the plan of like, here's the 3 steps that we're going to get to for having this stuff broken out. It feels like it's all in sort of Daniel's head, right? And
Daniel has written multiple docs for the API machinery bits that does not cover the kubectl bits where Jeff has written down something. There's not a coherent plan across the entire project, Joe, because it is not staffed. And until people cough up staff, it's not worth coming up with a plan for the whole project because people are going to need to actually work full-time on it for a while to come up with this plan. Daniel put a lot of time into it.
I think it's going to be so much harder to get folks to get involved when the communication for what's going on here is very much one-to-one, or at least it feels one-to-one. Now, there may be documents out there. These things don't get shared widely outside of API machinery. And they definitely don't get reviewed by the people that they impact big time. And so I think there's a certain amount of like, hey, we need people to get involved. And then like, and I totally hear that like this stuff is short staffed, but I don't feel like things are teed up to get people involved.
But this is not like a massively parallelizable activity. I'm not going to sign 100 people up to do 100 different bugs. There's like no way.
If we can't find ways to break it out and parallelize it, how do we make progress?
It needs to be like a small single-digit number of people pounding on it. It can't be 100 people. That's just a total waste of time. We spend more time like explaining to people what to do than actually doing the work. I'm not signing up for like we have hard data which shows that this is true.
So I'm conflicted because API machinery is possibly the hardest thing to do, to break out, the way it's structured, right? And its integrations. It is the hardest piece. And people have started on that first, and we have this half Frankenbeast.
So the reason that we had to start on the API machinery is because literally every bit of code in the Kubernetes repo depends on the API machinery.
Exactly.
Kubernetes is an API-centric system, and we are also using the API machinery for on-disk configuration. So basically every component and every functional part of the system touches the API machinery. In order to build anything new outside of the repository, whether it's CRDs or aggregated API servers or whatever, or even just like DNS, we needed to have API machinery available outside the Kubernetes repository. That is the reason. So the API machinery team, and Daniel in particular, and Chow and some others, did work to make those things available without having to vendor all of Kubernetes. And that took a while. It took like multiple quarters. We have that now. We are still not where we want to be because the development still is in Kubernetes, and it gets mirrored out for a bunch of these things. But we right now don't have bandwidth to continue pushing that forward, like unless more people get involved. Instead, we are working on unblocking moving out other things.
But in order to move out client Go, you've got to move out API machinery because some of the types leaked out of client Go are API machinery types. And so you actually have to pull, if you're going to use client Go, you immediately have to pull in API machinery.
So should we do kubeadm first? We already know that we can move to staging.
I think the biggest problem there is the release machinery about building and testing across multiple repos.
We already do that, Joe. We use Kubernetes Anywhere kops in many jobs. So it's not...
I know, but none of those things make it into the release tarball.
But should they be in the release tarball? Like, we're going to delete kube-up from the release tarball at some point.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think that's a different discussion.
Should not be in the release tarball, in my opinion.
What's that?
Kube control should not be in the release tarball, in my opinion.
Okay. So let's start with kube control, right? Here's the thing is that if we take the stuff that it's very difficult to start with stuff on the periphery like that, because then it means that, well, there's not a motivation to actually complete the work. Right, and that's the thing that worries me, is that we'll do the easy stuff and we won't actually end up doing this.
So I suggest we pound on kube control, because Jeff is currently working on that. We need to do that in order to build kube control extensions. So that is why we are currently focused on that. Much like API machinery work, we did enough work that we could unblock work on building aggregated API servers and CRDs and things like that out of the core repo. Now we are focused on breaking out pieces of kube control so we can build kube control extensions outside the main repo. So yeah, it's not moving code out of the main repo, but it's enabling us not to add more new stuff to the main repo. Like seriously, Joe, unless you can cough up engineers to work on this full time, like
I've been trying to be fair about this stuff, just because we are, as a company, we're pretty constrained, and so I don't have the capacity to. So I can bitch up to a certain level, but like there's my capacity to put engineers on it is limited. So I'm trying to be reasonable about this. It's just, I think it's a matter of, can we set the conditions so that like we can have more people getting involved, and I got to be honest,
more of the right kind of people, like more full-time people. I don't want 101% time people. That just totally wastes our time and consumes a huge amount of our bandwidth. If you actually look at the data, 90 or 95% of all contributors are only contribute a few CLs. So it costs us a huge amount of time to spend time mentoring people and then have them flake out and not continue on things for more than a month.
So Brian, I can sign up to get a small single-digit number of full-time engineers to tackle some of these problems, provided that we can enunciate exactly what they are. And I'm not talking about the technical details, like we just make it very clear what we want them to do and not do, and that we give them the mandate to do this, so that they don't have to jump through a whole bunch of political hoops as well, convincing SIGs to allow them to move code around or do whatever needs to be done. Provided that's the case, I have quite a lot of engineers, but I can't give them open-ended problems that involve them having to negotiate with SIGs in English in US time to get anything done.
Well, and I think this whole idea of being able to tell SIGs what to do and like move code around, that's going to go a lot easier if there's more documentation of what this roadmap looks like, right? I think a big part of this is like communicating what the plan is and what the impact is, because it does have impact across the entire project. So that's something that I think we need to, and I mean, just to back up, like, I think when you step back and look at this, what we have here is this refactoring project for API machinery has been going on for how long now? 9 months, a year, with a very small set of people, and it's been excruciatingly painful over a long amount of time, right? Now, I'm not going to say that there's not another way to do that, but for me, that sort of like lights up some warning bells that like, look, we need to find a better way to actually start cracking this nut open. And I don't know what that looks like, but like having a small number of people chipping it away at this over years doesn't feel like that's a great path forward.
So Daniel added something to the chat. We're not working on it at the moment. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I suggest we focus on kube control for the reasons I mentioned, and we actually have people working on it. Quentin, I understand the desire to be able to use people in other time zones. The political stuff I can deal with. The challenge is, in order to ramp people up and learn the code base and figure out how to move things around, a big part of it's a lot of grungy work, like trying to move stuff and figuring out where the entanglements are and the best way to break those entanglements. I think that is going to require interaction, potentially in real time, to make progress. I don't know how to avoid that for new people who are not that familiar with the code base.
Just to be clear, I mean, we have lots of people who are not new and are familiar with the code base, but they're busy on other things. So these new people would certainly have mentors close by who are familiar with the code base. I just don't want them to be forced to engage with a SIG on a regular basis to get a PR approved or reviewed or not kicked out, because that just makes an already difficult task even more difficult.
So why don't we, how about this? I'll sync up with Jeff and see where we are on identifying what needs to be done for kube control, because he was working on enumerating that. There's some amount of stuff that we're going to move to a common repo because it's shared between kube control and other parts of Kubernetes. And that stuff has to be disentangled first. So I think he has he's made a bunch of progress there. If we want to do something similar for some of the API machinery, Daniel, do we have build visibility rules in place for the API machinery?
I think we have. I'm pretty sure we have some build visibility rules. Yeah.
Okay.
So my understanding is that with kube control, the biggest issue is the reliance on internal types, and that is not easy.
It is one of the issues.
Well, I mean, and the biggest problem there is that like moving towards explicit types means that there ends up being a lot of duplicated code, a lot of like, because you can't use the conversion stuff built in and then work on the sort of,
Kube control shouldn't be doing any conversion.
Well, no, but the thing is that like, look, if I'm talking to a cluster that only has v1 beta 1 of an API or v1 of an API, right? And then I have to talk to it using the v1 API. But then kube control might want to say, oh, but if it happens to have v2 of the API, I'm going to use that to actually now use the extended. And so now kube control is in a mode where it actually has to talk to two different APIs. Whereas when it has access to the untyped APIs, it can obviously, work with the untyped stuff and then.
Right. So what we have been moving towards is, so for the most part, it should interoperate with the APIs generically and talk to whatever version the user specifies. For the specific cases like, say, kube control run, where it's generating a deployment or a job or something like that. Yes, it should use a specific version. My position there is those features should be relatively few and relatively stable. They should target stable versions of the APIs. So even as we introduce new API versions, like when we introduce apps v1 of deployment, it should not immediately move to that. It should wait. Right? It's going to be a while before we deprecate and remove all the beta versions. So there's time. There's already this dance we have to do where when we introduce a new API version, we can't actually make it the default storage version in etcd, because if you roll back your cluster, you'll be hosed because the API server won't be able to decode the resource. And we can't make it the preferred version in the API because versions of kube control won't be able to understand it either. So there's this dance we need to do when we roll out these new API versions of actually migrating clients to them, where we have to wait a certain number of release cycles before we can actually make that switch. So that is the pattern I recommend. We do some version negotiation in a few places in kube control, but for the most part, it should not be necessary.
So it seems that, like, how like a lot of the API server stuff has been broken out into generic API server, right? Is there a case to be made for breaking out kube control into generic kube?
Yes,
generic
we absolutely want to do that because we have other projects that want to use the API machinery even without aggregated API servers. And we want them to be able to do that. So you can just say, API tool apply or whatever, and instantiate all the resources.
Part of me wants to say, let's re-implement kube control outside of the repo, starting with the debuggable generic stuff first, and then add on the capabilities over time.
So there's a bunch of things we still need to do, and maybe we should talk about this in SIG CLI.
Yeah,
so
these things definitely cross.
But there's a list of known issues. Just for example, Clayton has been pounding on server side get and describe, right? So getting all that print logic out of kube control is We need to just do generic rendering in kubectl and have all the business logic of computing the data that needs to be presented in the server. That's needed for multiple reasons anyway. Like anything that wants to present the pod status the way kubectl does, basically has to copy paste the kubectl code that does that. So UIs do that, other clients do it. We need to get that code actually in the API server and just put it in a field in the pod status. So there are a bunch of known issues like that, or adding information to the Open API spec so that we don't have to look at the tags on the fields and the types from types.go, stuff like that. So it's going to be hard to do from scratch, I feel, because there are a bunch of these problems that we need to chip away at. Maybe after we chip away at them, if we're left with an abomination, someone could do a rewrite. But if someone does a rewrite now, they won't be able to do half the things that kubectl does.
So if I understand it, there's a handful of things in kubectl that need to be cleaned up in order to move it out. I mean, because it sounds like there's two things we're talking about here. One is refactoring it to move some more stuff server side so others can take advantage of it. And then there's the whole notion of moving it out. And it sounds like there's a handful of things that need to be done, and then it can be moved out. And some things like testing and stuff that need to be solved as well. I have some ideas on how to do some of that, and so I can bring it over to the folks in SIG CLI as far as breaking it out.
I wouldn't characterize moving stuff server side as refactoring, because in many cases new APIs have to be designed that don't currently exist.
Yeah, I was thinking of more of refactoring functionality. We're shifting stuff around. Same functionality staying there, it's just being moved. But potato. No? Okay.
I get scared every time people talk about moving stuff server side, because it's like, it's forever. It's a commitment.
Well, I mean, we've had functionality in kubectl for three years. Is that forever enough? Like,
you know, I understand the argument. It's just, yeah.
And server side is not necessarily.
I'm not gonna argue that point now.
Server side is not necessarily API server. It can also be controllers.
That makes me feel bad.
There's no way extensions are going to work unless we do this. There's no way version SKU is going to work unless we do this.
So
I have a logistical question that I want to ask. This really needs like a working group and a working group lead to make the execution of this even possible, because otherwise you're asking for people to come into something and they have to cherry pick across SIGs. The only structure that we have for this is a working group. Do we have a working group who's solely dedicated to this purpose?
We don't, because we don't have people who are solely dedicated to this purpose. We should not form a working group of a bunch of people working on it 10%. Like, I'm totally opposed to that.
I agree. But if we're going to start to throw resources at this, or if people are going to
if we actually get more than 2 people signed up to do this full time, I agree we should get a working group, even if just to have a dedicated Slack channel or something. But yeah. But yes, I mean, in terms of direction, as we talked about a little bit earlier, I would like to start drawing some lines in the sand. I haven't had time to catch up on the cloud provider thread, but that's definitely something I'm going to push on, see if we can potentially back out some of the KMS changes. It's a super critical feature, but I don't want it to work in kind of the opposite direction of where we need to go for project health. So I'm going to see if I can do something about that. But I would like to take a position that we don't put any new cloud provider code into Kubernetes. And in general, I'm looking for in 110 or 111 to draw a line and say only whitelisted changes can go into Kubernetes master. Everything else has to be in another repo or a feature branch.
So does this mean that the Vault integration is not going to go in tree?
I have to dig into that.
Because I think one of the things, and I'm going to channel Justin here a little bit, is that there's the encrypted secret stuff. The first iteration of that was the GCP stuff. Now the Vault stuff is being put in there. And it's like, well, what about AWS? And the answer is...
I can say a little bit about that.
There's a PR open.
What's that?
There's a PR open for Azure.
I can say a little bit about this. We agreed that the Vault integration was going to be our second concrete implementation of the thing.
Who's we?
The people working on it from Google, Greg and Jacob, and a couple Red Hatters. This was worked out in SIG auth and informal discussions in API machinery.
I mean, you gotta understand from the outside, this looks like, oh, one cloud provider gets in, but the other folks that are coming later have to sort of get in line behind something that's going to take versions to actually get out there in terms of extensive.
No, we're not going to do that. We're either going to let in the others or we're going to rip out Google's.
Okay. Wait, that sounds, I mean, that's what I wanted to hear there, because I think otherwise it's like it's really hard for us to
yeah,
really,
absolutely.
No, I mean, Lucas, bless him, was trying to hold the line, and I just didn't have time to engage on it before it got merged.
Okay.
Yeah, they gave us a lot of pressure to like merge it because it's a critical feature.
Who gave you a lot of pressure?
The people working on it.
But this is the thing, is that like a lot of pressure to merge it because it's an important thing, even though this is how we get into the problem that we're in right now. Right?
Yeah.
This is the argument that I railed against
absolutely.
about the webhook beta stuff, right?
So,
Yeah, we gave them a lot of pushback and made them like not link in a bunch of dependencies to the generic API server library that we didn't want. But there wasn't an equivalent person standing up for a cloud provider, and this was the only compromise that everyone could sort of hold our noses for.
So I mean, but this is the type of thing that like I think this group has to play a part in, is in terms of drawing the boundaries, and I think that's one of the places where the diagrams that we're talking about can help. Is that
yeah?
Like,
I think boundaries from this group would have made that a lot easier.
Okay. Hey, sorry, man.
So this is where I want to make it simple and just say, look, we have to get all the cloud provider specific stuff out of the tree, including KMS, including volumes. Like in the V2 version of the API, I don't want cloud provider specific volumes.
Yeah, so
that's the biggest thing I regret in the Kubernetes API, I would have to say.
I 100% agree, but there's also, we can't hamstring the cloud providers that are in there by making them adhere to a standard that isn't even baked yet. The external cloud provider stuff is stalled, and it isn't ready for prime time. And if we stop all entry development for cloud providers, and basically that's not an acceptable answer either. We need to find a way to have compensating controls around. Like if you commit to put something in there in the cloud provider, you're also committing to taking it out. So there's a double commit on the resources.
Yes. I mean, so Google is working on moving out our code. Yeah. We're definitely not there yet. It will take a couple of quarters at least.
Yeah, and Azure, same deal. But I had a team working on this. I mean, this is frustrating because we committed lots of engineering time to do the initial cut on this stuff, and basically that work is now just stalled because of other dependencies. So this is not good.
Jace, it's not stalled. We identified more stuff that needs to be pulled out from the GK-GC integration. There's at least 7 items there right now. And there are other people who are researching how to make OpenStack cloud provider work in an external fashion too. So things are going. So
one way we could go, which I'm not a huge fan of, but one possibility is we could say, if people need to work around some of these things in the short term. Well, first of all, I think putting a straw man schedule would help provide clarity to people, and we could say, well, this is the timeline. We'll still accept changes up to this release. After this release, only grandfathered ones can still make changes, and after this release, everybody has to be out. I think that would help a lot. Daniel giving that a thumbs up. So we should definitely try to do that. If we can get some, I agree, Joe, that it's definitely not clear and this stuff isn't shared widely enough. Maybe one thing we can do in SIG Architecture is consolidate the different efforts that are going on so that people can see where they are, and we can try to guess some rough timelines for how things should work. But in other areas, for example, I'm trying to get the test infrastructure where it needs to be so that we can do feature branches. The one big chain enabler for that happened recently is now all the stuff can run in one GCP project. So people don't need to create new projects to start tests on new branches. They just need to submit a PR, and anybody can do that. So we are chipping away at the obstacles to moving in the direction. But since most people on the project are still working on features, and everybody working on features takes bandwidth from us to work with them and review those features and help with the proposals and the designs, that slows down a lot of the project health work.
So I think one of the things that this group could do, and again, I haven't reviewed Jace's doc because I think it may mix in some of this, but earlier I proposed this model of boundaries, attractors, and communication, right? Like the layer cake diagram, if it's aspirational, ends up being talking about boundaries. We will not do this. We will not allow this. This is what's in, what's not in. This is a layer violation. That's a useful guidance in terms of how people build stuff. The attractors are like, here's the things that are the priorities are going to get priority in terms of review time. I'm sorry, your feature is going to get backed up behind this, right? And I think, and then communication helps people to understand what the priorities are, what those attractors are, and it prevents a certain amount of resentment of like, I don't know what the hell's going on, but I have all this churn that I have to deal with. And so I think, like if you're playing like real-time strategy games, there's this idea of concentrating fire, where it's like you shine a light on this is the thing that we're dealing with right now. And I feel like we're so spread out that across so much stuff because it's such a big project, and we don't have anybody shining a light saying this is the thing that we're focusing on now.
Yeah, that was a big reason why I pushed to get the DevStats dashboard in place and worked with them to get some initial set of dashboards. I will request that everybody look at those dashboards and think about what decisions we want to make or what lights we want to shine, and review regularly and make sure we have actionable data in the dashboard that can show that, right? Like I've had people even arguing till today about, are we really doing multiple repos or whatever? If you look at the data, you can see that we've had zero velocity improvement since January 2015 by any means other than adding repos. Zero, absolutely zero. And the latency to get things merged has grown monotonically.
So, and I think that that's great to motivate why this stuff is important. So don't get me wrong. I think there's still this matter of being able to hold the line and say, look, this is where we're spending our time on. I'm sorry, your feature's not going to make it in this time. I won't have time to review it, right? And being able to say that in a principled way. And being able, that's a great communication technique for why this is one of those things that we're actually making an attractor around and that we're trying to actually organize folks around.
Yeah, so I think... I'll send out some email about that kind of priorities and see if we can get some rough consensus on that within the project. I thought we had consensus at the leadership summit, but it would be helpful to maybe have a more actionable reminder.
Well, I think there's consensus that this is where we want to go, but it's easy to have consensus in the abstract, but then there's decisions on sort of where do we spend our time, what do we review, what do we approve.
There's also logistical appropriations. Like, it's not just a matter of saying like, yes, we think this is a good idea. It's like, how do we execute against this idea? And given that we're this large multi-organizational open source project.
We have about 250 monthly active contributors.
Yeah, and so I think that, and even if like, a lot of those have joined the project since we had the leadership summit. So I think we need to keep pounding in that this is the priorities, this is the thing that we're focusing on, this is the stuff that's actually going in above and beyond features. Now, I think one of the things that, as a company that we've done with Heptio is that we've tried to do things from the outside. We've tried not to increase the burden in terms of actually trying to get stuff into Kubernetes, and where we do, we're trying to do things that are enable more people to do more things in more places. So I've been trying to live that a little bit. We haven't had as much bandwidth, I think, to contribute as I'd like to the core stuff. But yeah, so I'm okay with if we say core features slow down, because that's how we've been building, assuming.
So Joe, I think you brought a great idea. I don't have access to it, but could we get a working session at the Contributor Summit to talk about breaking this stuff apart? So you get a bunch of people in a room, real time, who are interested in it, focused with whiteboard?
So I like that idea. One of the problems with the Contributor Summit is that it's very difficult to make decisions there because almost by necessity, you're not going to have all the decision makers in the room.
So I can also say we did this at the Leadership Summit. We had a session on this very topic, and it was pretty hard to make much progress because most people had not read the relevant code, right? Like it's hard to have a discussion on a whiteboard when people haven't done the homework in advance. And it's much harder to explain the problems pretty concretely in a way that you can make forward progress. Like you can motivate people and draw some high-level pictures. I tweeted actually one of my handful of tweets, Daniel's flip chart drawing of the multi-repo stuff, right? But I don't think that's going to move the needle. I don't think it's productive. Yeah. We need people actually looking at the code. So a hackathon or something might be a different story, but having a discussion and drawing pictures, I don't think is useful.
No, I'm with you. I think a hackathon there is definitely interesting. So I mean, one of the things that I think would be useful, and I think we just need to keep some of this stuff top of mind. If this really is our top priority, and I think this plus extensibility points meet the bar there, like doing things, and I know it's a little bit painful, but like a check-in of sort of what's happening with the refactor this week, every other week or something like that at the community meeting, right?
Yes.
It's just, we just got to keep hammering in that this is the thing that's important. This is what people should be paying attention to. It's painful, but it's necessary. Here's why it's necessary. We just got to repeat that again and again.
Yes, I agree with shining light in the community meetings. I definitely want to do that. That's something I want to do with the stats as well, but asking for status on the extensibility efforts is a good way to remind people that that's what we're focused on. Yeah, so we're almost out of time. I thought there were other topics.
We hit the one, which was talking about what do we do with stuff that's in tree that needs to be out of tree, and we still don't really have an answer on that, which is frustrating.
Well, I'm going to dig into the KMS one specifically and figure out what to do about that, because I think that's an area where we just need an answer. Are we going to allow cloud providers in for some amount of time, or are we going to back out what we did?
Yeah.
I think those are really the only two rational options. Daniel made the point that one benefit of putting stuff in tree is it allows us to get a few examples before we generalize the extension API. Yeah, maybe.
Isn't that why we have alpha?
That's my like fallback concession position. I was in favor of generalizing this.
So one example of where this came up before is Brendan tried to extend the cloud provider API to cover object storage, and I just said no, we can't do that. That is not the slippery slope I want to start sliding down.
I'm sorry.
So
it's an interesting idea, but not necessarily something we want to bake in. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so what I would like to do for office hours next week, I will try to find time to look at the agenda in advance. But one thing I am seriously concerned with is, I won't say scaling the project because we're way beyond mythical man month territory here. We don't need more contributors. We need more productive contributors. So rather than answering questions one-off, I want everyone to think about if a question comes up that we think is going to be applicable in the future to other situations that are similar, we should try to write down the answer and not just say the answer. Right. So I want the API conventions, for example, to expand pretty dramatically. We talked about, well, watch isn't documented in whatever. Well, let's start documenting this stuff. So I'm going to try to take a pretty hard line there. I get asked things like all day long, every day. I'm going to stop answering people and start spending time writing stuff down, because usually what I do is I say, okay, now you write down what I said to see if you understand, and then that never happens. So I'm going to stop doing that, and I'm going to try to write down answers instead.
No, that's a great idea.
I like that. My one question is, once it's written down, how is it going to be communicated out so people know there's this new thing that's worth looking at? Because
Well,
if it's in the
so-
docs, people won't just naturally discover it.
Excellent question. So I've had some thoughts about that. So the API conventions in particular, I can announce when there are updates. I can also present it every, I don't know, 6 months or something, and evolve it that way. Like I recently did an internal presentation about Kubernetes API conventions for folks, and it had some Google specific orientation because within Google, people build their APIs a certain different way. So it's more to teach them how to bend their thinking to it. But we could do a similar external presentation that's more for a general audience. There's space in today's community agenda. Yeah, I'll whip up a presentation in the next half hour.
I was just going to say, Brian, that the biggest thing is actually just to write it down and get it in the documentation for Kubernetes, because there's a thing called a search engine that people can find it with. And at the very least, when somebody says, Brian, what's the answer to this? You can say, go and look in the documentation. So even if you don't do a single presentation or communicate any of this stuff other than commit a PR, I think that's like an enormous step forward.
Yes. Yeah. So, especially when decisions come up here, like the conditions discussion we had a few meetings ago, for example, I asked that to get written down. I don't think it happened. So maybe I'll go do that. I've kind of been accumulating on the theory that it probably wouldn't get written down because that's been happening a lot. I started collecting these things as notes, so I'll start transliterating those notes into docs.
All right, we're at time. Thank you, everybody, for your valuable time. We'll see you hopefully next week in office hours, because it looks like we're going to have a full discussion there as well. So thanks, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, I have a quick question for DIMS. Are you the best contact for the external cloud provider stuff?
Sure. Me or Lucas, either one.
Okay, and for Z, I think you typed something in the chat when the meeting was closing last time, but I didn't get your contact info. Can you send me contact info if you have a question or something? Okay, thanks. Got it.
You got it? Okay, cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.